Us Patriots, welcome back to the Gran Torino. Thanks for joining me again on another episode of the Gran Torino. Hop in the back, let's go for a spin around the block, and want to bring a couple of news articles to your attention. Before I get started, as I always do, I implore, I beseech, I importune you. Please don't forget, press the like button, press the subscription button and the bell, and you'll be reminded of future broadcasts here on the Gran Torino. All helps with the algorithms, as they say. Couple of events happening over the weekend, which I'll touch on towards the end. But a couple of articles I want to first bring to your attention and read through with you, starting with this here from the Journal. And it's in relation to the Green Party's call for the reduction in the number of cows farmed, and that the farmers' response was calling it an attack. This from the journal.ie. A new global report has warned that the world cannot sustain our demand for food. The Irish Farmers Association has hit out calls by the Green Party that the national dairy and beef herds should be reduced following a landmark climate report published yesterday. The report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change on the links between the land we live off and climate change and painted a grim picture of how the planet's life support systems will continue to suffer as global temperatures rise. It warned that the efforts to limit global warming while feeding a booming population could be wrecked without swift and sweeping changes to how we use the land we live off. Although it mostly steered clear of the controversial calls to limit meat consumption, the report did recommend that humans should move towards more balanced diets of plant-based foods such as grains and nuts. It found that agriculture and its supply lines account for as much as 37% of all human-made emissions, and current industrialized production and global food chains contribute to vast food inequality. Ireland focus. While the report doesn't contain much country-specific data, it has renewed focus in Ireland on how the country produces food and the use of land here. About a third of Ireland's heat-trapping greenhouse gas emissions come from our agricultural sector, an unusually high rate attributed to our cattle herd used in beef and dairy production. The national herd number of cattle in Ireland is currently just under 7 million cattle are ruminants, animals which require nutrients from grass and other plants by fermenting it in their stomachs. This process releases methane, a GHG that remains in the Earth's atmosphere and traps heat. Other environmentally damaging aspects of beef and dairy farming have to do with the use of fertilizer and pesticides. And as I read this, I'll remind you again that Monsanto and Roundup have also been proven in the United States to be causing cancer and are currently facing numerous litigations over in the United States. So I ask you, even as the regular gardener, please be wary of your use of that product. Following on from yesterday's report, the Green Party, here we go, they're all swinging. The Green Party's called for a national land use plan to see how the country could reduce emissions and diversify its agricultural system away from an over-reliance on beef and dairy. This is Ireland! The beef sector is not profitable and it's not working for Irish farmers, Green Party councillor David Healy said today on RTE's Morning Ireland. So what we need to do is look at our agricultural system and diversify it and to take the economic opportunities that are there. IFA response, this is the Irish Farmers Association. Responding yesterday, the Irish Farmers Association said that the Green Party's continuous attack on our national herd lacks climate credibility. Farmers in Ireland have a proud climate record, with the European Union's Joint Research Centre confirming that our dairy farmers are number one and our beef farmers are in the top 5 when it comes to climate-friendly food production, IFA Environment Chairman Thomas Cooney said in a statement. Speaking today, IFA President Joe Healy added to this, saying that reducing cattle numbers here would only allow less carbon-efficient countries, for example, Brazil, who Europe have just signed a new trade agreement with, which will put direct competition on our Irish and beef farmer production or beef production over here in this country. So I see it's becoming clearer and clearer to the Irish beef sector and the dairy section that the EU is not so much friendly towards you as you may seem to think. We're very clear in the IFA that our farming members are doing a lot for climate. There's always ways we can do more, he said. Climate is not just an Irish issue, it's a global issue. Since 1990, we have increased agricultural output by 40%, and in that time, we've done that by not increasing our carbon emissions. David Healy said the global demand for beef and dairy needed to be addressed. It simply isn't going to be possible for the planet to supply beef and dairy, in particular at the levels which are predicted, he said. David Healy said demand for beef and dairy was already decreasing in developed nations like Ireland and the US. The government's climate action plan, published in June, contains no comments to reduce the national herd. While emissions are due to fall across most sectors over the next 10 years, emissions from agriculture are likely to rise as the country increases to increase dairy production. I'll also make note as well, there's still simply nothing on mainstream or anything that I've read anywhere else about the suckler calf in this country, the reduction by an almost 50,000 culling of suckling calves here in Ireland, as dictated by EU, which have already gone on the way. And I'm sure many, many farmers are incensed by that. Leading away from that, I'm hopefully going to conduct another interview with another guest that we had on previously, who's away in Texas at the moment, reporting on the Farmers Association in the United States and their means, and to try and get some feedback from him good self. I won't mention it till it's confirmed, but hopefully that interview will go ahead, and it'll bring more light onto this climate action plan that's now directing its focus on the beef and dairy industry here in Ireland, and having a very major direct impact, as along with the Euro-Brazilian trade agreement that's just been set up. So leading away with that, and I before I steer away too much, I just want to draw your attention to that figure. I said near 50,000 suckling calves have already been culled on the demand of the EU. Go check it out. Leave your comments in the description box or in the comment section down below. Sweeping away from that, made mention earlier on of a couple of events happening over the weekend, a couple of protests. Both seem to have been, well, the second seems to have arranged its time and its final resting place to coordinate in another already peaceful process that's already happening outside Google HQ, where the Gemma O'Doherty has been conducting a daily protest about the censorship of both her channels have been taken down for prescribed hate speech infringements, with which infringements have not been made clear. So one led on to the other of the censorship of that channel being taken down on perceived hate speech. But again, no proof of the hate speech is forthcoming. So we can see the behemoth that is Google trying to just close up and not have any effect. But I note that Gemma O'Doherty has currently been doing the circuits and garnering a lot of attention from a lot of media sources around the world, focusing in on her daily protests outside Dublin Google HQ, and I believe she is having a tremendous effect. But I also note that the new campaign directly set up for Saturday, tomorrow, will start at Innistown Garda Station, calling for the desistance of hate speech, but yet no clarification of the hate speech. A lot of fancy rhetoric. And I'll note that there's a Green Party member who said that they'll be in attendance, who has a very vociferous social media presence. Won't touch on that too much, but I'd say the Green Party sticking their fingers in the pie here now of the farmers market, and now coming out on the streets to protest against a peaceful protest which was banned, which is protesting against the censorship over here in Ireland. So that doesn't make sense. So I know that location, those protests will be merging at various locations inside Dublin tomorrow, and I will be in town tomorrow, and I'll be reporting on, who knows, maybe both locations. We shall see. But I'll see you there tomorrow, Patriots, one way or the other. And I also, for my viewers across the world, keep it tuned in. Around about 3 p.m. GMT tomorrow, in and around that time, the stream will be kicking off. So I will talk to you then, Patriots. The second I'll also bring to the Green Party's attendee who was attending one of the protests tomorrow, talking, and they're very much in favour of open borders. But I will remind them of this article from another Irish publication when a Dublin teacher was deported from China over a ripped passport page. This was posted on July the 4th, 2018, and I'll leave all the links in the description box below. You can read through them at your own perusal and peruse through them at your own time. But this article was a teacher from Dublin has told of his nightmare experience after being deported from China over a ripped page in his passport. Jordan Donnelly, 25, from Lucan, was due to board a connecting flight to Taiwan at Shanghai Pudong International Airport when he was refused entry last week. The two friends he was travelling with were sent through while he was stopped and refused entry at the check-in desk. I was absolutely terrified, he says of the experience. Anytime I moved, somebody would scream at me. I asked 3 or 4 people who worked in the airport for help, and nobody would help me. Jordan was held for 12 hours and was given no information as to what would happen next. I was absolutely freaked out. They wouldn't give me my passport back. If they had, I've said it was due to whatever reason, you're not allowed in, but they didn't, he said. The guy was like, okay, you sit down there, and more or less refused me entry to the country. The passport is ripped, and that's fine, but you just don't expect something like this to happen. The young man, who is a secondary school teacher, had been planning the trip since March and lost out the money he spent on booking the trip. He had flown from Dublin to Amsterdam and then into Shanghai, where he had planned to catch the final connection to Taiwan for 2.5 weeks. Some guy comes up to me and says, okay, let's go. He brought me to the check-in desk for KLM, and they were putting me on the next flight. They knew I came from Dublin initially, so they were supposed to get me back there, he says. But he was sent back to Amsterdam instead, where he had to make his own way home. He said he had flown with that passport previously, and it had never been an issue before, but he wouldn't be taking that risk again. Passport control, border control. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And it wasn't a famine; it was a genocide. These, from my other worldwide viewers, these are just little toings and froings as it pertains to over here. And I'll finish off on what I thought was an absolutely nice little piece here from the Mises Institute. And it kind of ties in with the conversations that's kind of currently going around, not only on social media, but around the world, I would imagine. And just to put some context on the subject of nation and state, this article from Dusty Wunderlich from the Mises Institute. And again, I'll link the article down below. But I just want to finish off on this piece, and I think it's kind of a further expansion of what I believe Liga's nation of nations philosophy coming from Liga and Italy. When they do ascend into the power in the European branch, there might be a chance of reforming Brussels. Now, I would initially have called for an Irish exit. I think an Irish exit with Brexit happening at the same time would be more conducive for us, as we are bigger. They take in 80% of our exports. As it stands, they're our biggest trading partner. The nonsense that we now have to see that to have a united Ireland without a hard border is going to come. The 27th Amendment is now starting to become talked about in certain corners of Ireland. But this article here I wanted to touch on, and I'll read through it as quickly as I can, but just take note. I like where Dusty's head is at on this. The article is Nation and State Are Two Different Things by Dusty Wunderlich. I recently returned from 2 weeks abroad in Russia. I did the usual sightseeing, but my main objective was to climb the highest peak in Europe, Mount Elbrus, which happens to be in southern Russia. This is the 4th of the 7 highest peaks on each continent I had the opportunity to climb. What I find most interesting about climbing these peaks is their international allure. The base camps of these peaks are always international melting pots. People from all over the world travel to these remote areas with the same goal in mind. On the mountain, political and geographic borders are of little importance to the participants. Individuals across cultures, languages, and borders interact freely and peacefully, with almost no central controlling hand dictating the rules. One could argue these wild and remote places become as Rothbard might call them, temporary nations of consent. The individuals had come to this mountain to trade and work together were not all the same, of course. We all came, excuse me, we all come from different groups and different places. We were all part of different nations. Nation and states are two very different things. Many often tend to conflate the idea of the nation and the state. However, as Rothbard so eloquently identified in his essay, Nations by Consent, the nation is not the same thing as the state, a difference that earlier libertarians and classical liberals, such as Ludwig von Mises and Albert J. Nock, understood full well. Contemporary libertarians often assume, mistakenly, that individuals are bound to each other only by the nexus of market exchange. They forget that everyone is necessarily born into a family, a language, and a culture. Every person is born into one or several overlapping communities, usually including an ethnic group with specific values, cultures, religious beliefs, and traditions. He is generally born into a country. He is always born into a specific historical context of time and place, meaning neighborhood and land area. This was clear even in our little base camp on the mountain. After several days on the mountain, we reached the summit and we were greeted with a display of world flags. But it wasn't France or Mexico that climbed Elbrus. It was the work of one individual cooperating with many other individuals across many geographic borders. Did the climbers who left behind these flags to salute the governments under which they lived? Or were they taking pride in their national origins? It was most likely the latter. In fact, disapproval of the state was obvious from many conversations on the mountain. None of us on the mountain wanted to be defined by the actions of our governments. Conversations regarding the actions of our governments were always dismissed with disapproval from both parties. Without communicating it verbally, we all understood it was not important to our individual relationships. This was especially significant given that we were in Russia, but it was understood among the climbers that the tension being manufactured between Russia and the United States was mostly due to the agendas of an elite few within each state, an elite few, more to follow. This tension was recognized to be far removed from the individuals that just wanted to cooperate with one another, or in this case, climb a mountain together. But even as we recognized we were being ill-served by our respective governments, nearly every climber still had pride in his or her nation. Nations matter. As libertarians, we must respect and understand this distinction. We cannot depersonalize the importance of culture, land, and language in the stateless society. The work that needs to be done is a fundamental understanding of the separation of the nation and state. In sum, if we proceed with the decomposition and the decentralization of the modern centralizing and coercive nation state, deconstructing that state into constituent nationalities and neighborhoods, we shall at one and at the same time reduce the scope of government power, the scope and importance of voting, and the extent of social conflict. The scope of private contract and of voluntary consent will be enhanced, and the brutal and repressive state will be gradually dissolved into a harmonious and increasingly prosperous social order. Kind of a couple of levels up, but the broad spectrum of conversation as it pertains to the separation between the nation and the state, the nation of Ireland and the government and the state itself. When it doesn't start to serve, the nation has to start stepping up and curtail the state's overreaching powers on our individual, inalienable, constitutionally given rights, freedom of expression. This is what all this contemptuous protests will be fermenting over the weekend. So let me just leave it both by there. I want to thank you for joining me on this quick episode of the Grand Torino. Again, I remind you, keep your eyes peeled for a stream tomorrow, and I'll be reporting from one or other of said protests, which I mentioned to you tomorrow. Kicking off, let me say, 14:30 GMT to approximately 15:30, in and around. With that, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, I'll leave the links to the articles down below for your perusal. Have a read through, especially have a look at the Why Nation States Matter there by Dusty Wunderlich. Fascinating little piece. And on that note, see you again on the next episode of the Grand Torino. Wuss.